They never wrote this down. They buried it under date, under prayer, under time. But if you listen closely, too closely, you can still hear the screaming stop, all on the same day. In 1892, in a forgotten pocket of Alabama, there was a village that should not have existed as long as it did. No maps lingered. No photographs survived intact. Even the census records hesitate, as if the ink itself was afraid to commit. But one detail leaked through the cracks of history like blood through floorboards. Every pregnancy ended on the same date. Same month. Same day. Same silence afterward. Not one woman carried to tame. Not one child cried. And no one ever spoke of it twice. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore meant to entertain. This is a case study in control of bodies, belief, and obedience, hidden behind religion, medicine, and faith. What happened there wasn't an accident. It was a system. And systems like that don't die. They evolve. Imagine a village where hope itself becomes scheduled, where women stop asking if the baby will survive and only ask when it will be taken. Imagine the psychological weight of that certainty, the way it trains the mind to submit before resistance can even form. That is not tragedy. That is conditioning. Official records blamed fever. Midwives whispered about God's will. Men were told it was not their concern. But patterns do not form by chance, not this precise, not disobedient. The same date, year after year. No deviation. You need to understand something before we go any deeper. History doesn't hide truth by erasing it. It hides truth by normalizing the unthinkable until no one questions it anymore. The most dangerous crimes are the ones that convince their victims they are inevitable. This village was not isolated by geography. It was isolated by belief, by the idea that suffering had purpose, and that questioning it was sinful. And somewhere inside that belief system was a mechanism so efficient, so quietly enforced, that an entire population accepted the impossible as routine. This is where forbidden history begins, not with monsters in the dark, but with institutions in the light. Churches, doctors, elders, men who claim to protect while extracting obedience. Men who understood that if you control reproduction, you control the future. As we descend into this story, I want you to notice how often it mirrors the modern world. Different names, same mechanisms, same silence. Because once you see how it was done then, you can never unsee how it's being done now. And that is why this knowledge was never meant for you. The village called it mercy. That's how it always starts. Mercy is the word power uses when it wants obedience without resistance. In 1892 Alabama, mercy came in the form of sermons whispered from splintered pulpits and remedies mixed behind closed doors. The men in charge spoke softly, carried ledgers, and wore the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice. When a woman felt the first pain, the date was already decided for her. Not by nature, by agreement. You see, the human mind will accept almost anything if it believes the suffering is shared. When every woman loses her child on the same day, grief stops being personal. It becomes ritual. And rituals are the backbone of psychological control. They don't need chains. They create their own. Midwives began preparing weeks in advance. Not for birth, but for loss. Clean sheets. Hot water. The same herbs every time. Always the same herbs. Officially, they were meant to ease complications. Unofficially, no one ever asked why the timing was so precise, why the symptoms were identical, why the aftermath was always swift, quiet, and terminal to hope. Doctors from neighboring towns visited once a year, always just before the date, always left immediately after. They wrote nothing down that could be traced. What they took with them was never recorded. Samples, notes, or something far worse. Confirmation that the system still worked. Men in the village were instructed not to interfere. They were told women's bodies were unpredictable, cursed, fragile. The oldest lie in Power's handbook, this is too complex for you. And so fathers learned to look away. Husbands learned to drink. Sons learned early that curiosity was dangerous. This wasn't ignorance. It was engineered compliance. Here's the truth most history books won't touch. Large-scale manipulation doesn't require evil masterminds. It requires distributed responsibility. One person gives the sermon. Another mixes the remedy. Another signs the ledger. Another digs the graves. No one feels fully guilty, because no one feels fully responsible. And that is how an entire village participated in something monstrous without ever naming it. The same date became sacred. A cleansing. A cycle. Language softened the brutality until it sounded inevitable. Natural. God-ordained. Once suffering is framed as destiny, resistance feels like rebellion against reality itself. This village wasn't cursed. It was trained. And what they were training was not obedience to God, but obedience to authority wearing God's face. As we move forward, pay attention to this pattern, because this wasn't the first time it happened, and it certainly wasn't the last. What finally exposes a controlled system is not outrage. It's inconsistency. And in this village, the inconsistency was a single woman who didn't follow the script. Her name never survived intact, only fragments. A lost initial in a church margin. A reference in a doctor's note that shouldn't exist. She became pregnant later than the others, just weeks behind the cycle. That alone should have spared her. Nature doesn't synchronize like machinery. But when the date arrived, her body responded anyway. That's when the illusion cracked. She hadn't reached the stage where complications were expected. There was no medical justification, no fever, no hemorrhage, and yet the same outcome arrived, right on schedule. Same hour, same method, same silence. Something external had intervened. This is where the story turns from tragedy into evidence. The midwives reacted not with surprise, but with urgency. The doctor who wasn't due for another visit arrived early. The sermon that week was longer, heavier, almost defensive, and the men who usually stayed away were ordered out of town under the excuse of preparation. Control systems panic when patterns are threatened. You see, true power doesn't need secrecy forever. It only needs secrecy long enough for behavior to become habit. Once people internalize the rules, enforcement becomes automatic. That village had reached that stage years earlier. The date wasn't enforced by gods. It was enforced by expectation. The woman began asking questions. Why this day? Why the same herbs? Why no one ever survives? Questions are dangerous, not because they bring answers, but because they remind people they can ask. She was isolated immediately. Told stress was the cause. Told doubt invited punishment. Told that speaking about it would spread the condition. The same tactic used in every era. Label curiosity as contagion. Here's what the official records never explain. Why pregnancies were allowed to happen at all. If this was simply incompetence or disease, prevention would have been the focus. But reproduction continued, year after year, only to be terminated on schedule. That means the outcome wasn't the goal. The process was. Hope raised, then crushed. Again and again. A population locked into grief cycles is easy to manage. Broken men don't rebel. Traumatized women don't organize. Children never born never question the world they inherit. This wasn't about bodies. It was about behavioral shaping. And that woman, by noticing the timing, threatened to expose the mechanism beneath the myth. What happened to her next was never written down. But the date after her questions, the silence was heavier than ever. After her questions, the village changed its rhythm. Not visibly, not in ways outsiders would notice. But power doesn't move loudly when it's confident. It tightens. It simplifies. It removes variables. And the first variable removed was memory. Church records from that year show gaps, entire weeks missing, as if time itself had been edited. Gravestones stopped listing dates, only ages. Midwives who had served for decades suddenly retired or vanished. One was said to have returned north. Another married. A third simply ceased to exist in any document after the appointed day. This is how forbidden history survives, not erased, but fragmented, broken into pieces too small to threaten the whole. The woman who questioned the pattern was never seen again after the next cycle. No burial, no prayer, no mention. The village absorbed her absence the same way it absorbed the losses before it, quietly, obediently, with relief. Because silence feels safer than truth once fear has been installed. Here's something most men don't realize until it's too late. Control systems don't fear rebellion as much as they fear pattern recognition. One man noticing repetition is nothing. One woman asking why is manageable. But the moment patterns are spoken aloud, power loses its invisibility. So the system adapted. From that year forward, pregnancies were no longer discussed openly. Women were instructed to wait for guidance. Men were told not to mark calendars. The date remained, but it became unspoken. You didn't say it. You felt it. Like a storm you pretended not to see until it arrived. And still, every year, it arrived. The same physical symptoms. The same collapse. The same outcome. Which tells us something chilling. Whatever was causing this did not require consent. Only access. Access granted through trust and authority. Look closely at the structure. A closed community. Centralized leadership. Moral pressure. Medical dependency. Religious framing. This was not a freak event. It was a prototype. Long before the language of psychology existed, these institutions understood human leverage points. Hope, shame, faith, fear of isolation. They learned that if you align those forces, you don't need violence. People will police themselves. That village became a training ground, not just for obedience, but for intergenerational submission. The men learned helplessness. The women learned inevitability. And the children, never born, never had the chance to disrupt the cycle. This is the part of history that's most dangerous to learn. Not what they did, but how easily it worked. Because once you see it, you start recognizing the architecture everywhere. And that's when the descent truly begins. By the 5th year, no one remembered a time before the date. That's the final phase of control, when memory itself is rewritten, not by force, but by repetition. Trauma repeated enough times stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like weather. Unavoidable. Impersonal. Something you plan your life around instead of fighting. Young girls grew up watching their mothers prepare for loss the way other women prepared for birth. They learned the order of the steps before they learned to read. Heat the water. Close the shutters. Speak softly. Don't cry too loudly. Grief, like everything else, had rules. This is where the real corruption lived, not in a single act, but in the education of expectation. Men learned early that masculinity meant endurance, not protection. You couldn't stop it. You couldn't question it. You could only survive it. So they hardened. They drank. They worked. They turned pain into silence because silence was rewarded with belonging. And belonging is the currency of every closed system. Outsiders occasionally passed through. Travelers, traders, men who noticed the absence of children and asked uncomfortable questions. They were fed stories. Badland. Inherited weakness. God's test. Explanations that sounded plausible enough to prevent deeper inquiry. And because no one wants to believe an entire community could be complicit in something monstrous, the visitors accepted the answers and moved on. This is how darkness hides in plain sight, by relying on the assumption that evil must look dramatic. But real corruption looks boring. Routine. Administrative. Here's what the official histories never say. The village prospered economically during those years. No children meant fewer mouths. Labor was predictable. Resources concentrated upward. The church grew. The clinic expanded. Order was maintained. Ask yourself who benefits when a population stops reproducing freely. Ask yourself who benefits when grief replaces rebellion. There are whispers, only whispers, of correspondence between village leaders and institutions far beyond Alabama. Universities, religious councils, medical boards experimenting in the shadows of progress. The late 19th century was obsessed with control, of disease, of morality, of populations deemed unfit. Eugenics didn't begin in textbooks. It began in villages like this. Places small enough to test ideas. Isolated enough to contain fallout. Disposable enough to erase. And once the method was proven, once they knew how to synchronize bodies, beliefs, and obedience, the village was no longer needed. That's the most unsettling part. Because systems that no longer need their test subjects don't leave witnesses behind. They leave silence. And silence, when preserved long enough, becomes history's most reliable accomplice. When a system finishes testing, it doesn't announce completion. It withdraws. In the final recorded year, something changed again. The doctors didn't arrive. The sermons shortened. The elders met less often. It was as if the invisible hand guiding the village had loosened its grip, not because mercy was granted, but because interest had faded. This is a detail most people miss. Power is not sentimental. Once it extracts what it needs, it moves on without ceremony. That year, the date still came. The outcome was the same. But afterward, there was no explanation offered. No comforting language. No theological framing. Just exhaustion. The kind that settles into bones when a mind finally realizes it has been used. Several families left within months. Not in defiance. Quietly. At night. Selling land for nothing. Leaving furniture behind. The kind of departure that doesn't ask permission because it no longer believes permission matters. Those who stayed noticed something else disturbing. Pregnancies stopped entirely. Not reduced. Not delayed. Gone. For the first time in decades, women's bodies did not respond to hope at all. No signs. No cycles. No expectations. Whatever had been introduced, chemically, medically, ritually, had done more than terminate pregnancies. It had altered the population itself. This is where myth and reality blur, because the records fracture completely. Some say the land was poisoned. Others whisper about treatments that didn't end when the testing did. But here's what cannot be denied. A village once defined by synchronized loss became defined by sterility. A closed loop. This is the outcome institutional control always aims for. Not chaos, not death, but predictability. A population that no longer produces the unexpected. No new variables. No future resistance. And when the future is neutralized, history becomes manageable. Within 10 years, the village ceased to exist as a living community. Buildings decayed. Names vanished. Boundaries were redrawn. On later maps, the area is marked as unsettled, as if no one had ever lived there at all. That is the final insult of forbidden history, not the suffering, but the erasure of its meaning. Because pain without memory cannot warn the next generation. As you listen to this, understand why stories like this were never meant to reach you. Not because they are untrue, but because they reveal a pattern that still operates. Different language. Different justifications. Same architecture. Once you recognize it, you start asking questions that make systems uncomfortable. And from this point forward, this descent stops being about them. It becomes about you. Here's where most men pull back. Not because the story is too dark, but because it starts reflecting something familiar. Control always feels distant until you recognize its shape in your own life. And the shape is always the same. Rules you didn't choose. Limits you didn't set. Outcomes you were trained to accept. The Alabama village wasn't destroyed by force. It was domesticated. Think about that. Domestication is not violence. It's conditioning. You feed just enough. Punish just enough. Reward compliance. Discourage curiosity. Over time, the subject stops imagining alternatives. Freedom becomes abstract. Danger feels safer than change. That village reached domestication long before the final year. Women stopped asking about their bodies. Men stopped expecting heirs. Desire itself became muted, not because people didn't feel it, but because feeling without agency is torture. So the mind adapts. It numbs. It obeys. This is why the system worked so well. It didn't just control events. It reshaped identity. Women were taught their bodies were unreliable. Men were taught their protection was irrelevant. Both were taught to outsource authority. To doctors. To clergy. To elders who claimed knowledge while withholding truth. And once authority is externalized, self-mastery dies quietly. Here's the darker layer most historians avoid. This village wasn't unique. It was simply complete. Other communities experienced fragments, forced sterilizations, religious cleansings, medical trials masked as care. But this village ran the full experiment, from hope to loss to acceptance to erasure. A closed demonstration. That's why no prosecutions followed. No investigations. No scandal. Because nothing went wrong. The system achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. When people ask, how could they let this happen? They misunderstand power. Power doesn't ask permission. It creates environments where resistance feels irrational. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. The mechanisms used there didn't disappear with the 19th century. They were refined, institutionalized, legalized, sanitized with better language, public health, moral reform, social stability, national interest. Different words, same levers. You were not taught this history because it trains a dangerous skill, pattern recognition across time. A man who sees patterns stops being reactive. He stops accepting surface explanations. He starts asking who benefits and who pays. That kind of man is hard to manage. Which is why the next section matters more than the ones before it. Because this is where the knowledge stops being historical and starts becoming personal. There's a reason this story lingers in your chest instead of your head. It's not about Alabama. It's not about 1892. It's about initiation. Every control system has an initiation phase, an unspoken moment when the subject internalizes the rules and begins enforcing them on himself. In that village, initiation happened the first time a woman felt life inside her and already knew the ending. Hope became a performance. Pregnancy became theater. Grief became scheduled. That is not failure. That is programming. Once a man accepts that certain outcomes are inevitable, his behavior shifts. He stops preparing for victory and starts preparing for survival. He chooses smaller dreams, safer risks. He trades potential for predictability, and predictability is the oxygen of institutions. The men in that village didn't rebel because rebellion requires belief in change. They had been trained out of that belief long before the final years. When reproduction ended completely, there was no uprising, only resignation. The system didn't collapse. It completed its work. This is the part no one warns you about. The most effective prisons don't have walls. They have narratives. Stories that explain why resistance is pointless, why suffering is normal, why authority knows better than you ever could. And those narratives don't stay in one place. They migrate. They attach themselves to new causes, new fears, new crises. Always framed as protection. Always justified by experts. Always temporary, until it isn't. Ask yourself why modern systems are obsessed with data, cycles, metrics, compliance. Ask why human behavior is increasingly treated as something to be optimized rather than understood. Ask why discomfort is framed as danger, and obedience is framed as virtue. These questions are uncomfortable because they threaten the same thing that woman's questions threatened in 1892, the illusion that the system exists for your benefit. Here's the truth that separates men who stay asleep from men who wake up. Control doesn't begin by taking your freedom. It begins by offering to manage it for you. The village accepted management of health, of morality, of reproduction, and once management was normalized, ownership quietly vanished. That's the real inheritance of that place, not the suffering, but the method. And now that you see the method, the descent accelerates. Because from here on, you're no longer just listening. You're being tested. Not by me, by what you're willing to notice, and what you're willing to ignore. Every system leaves residue. Even the most carefully erased experiments leave behind behaviors, instincts, reflexes that don't belong to nature. Long after the village disappeared, nearby towns reported something strange, not dramatic, not provable, but persistent. Birth rates lower than surrounding regions. Unusual rates of infertility. A cultural discomfort around pregnancy that couldn't be traced to any single event. This is how influence spreads when records don't. Trauma doesn't need documentation to migrate. It travels through families, through silence, through the things people don't say to their sons. Men from the region grew up cautious, restrained, instinctively skeptical of hope tied to legacy. They worked hard. They obeyed rules. But they rarely planned far ahead. The future felt unreliable. That's not coincidence. That's inheritance. What happened in that village didn't end when the buildings fell apart. It echoed outward, diluted but intact, like a toxin introduced upstream. By the time anyone notices the effects downstream, the source is long gone, and officially, it never existed. This is why forbidden history is so dangerous. It doesn't just expose past crimes. It explains present limitations. Men today often ask why ambition feels heavier than it should. Why starting a family feels risky even when logic says it isn't. Why institutions speak endlessly about protection, while quietly shrinking individual agency. They feel something is wrong, but they can't name it. That nameless pressure has a lineage. Control systems don't aim to rule forever. They aim to shape behavior long enough that future generations enforce the limits themselves. The Alabama village reached that endpoint. Once the lesson was imprinted deeply enough, the environment no longer mattered. Think about that. The village wasn't shut down. It wasn't punished. It was simply unnecessary. That is the mark of a successful experiment. Here's where this becomes uncomfortable for you personally. Every man alive today lives inside systems built on lessons learned in places like that. Refined, modernized, stripped of religious language and dressed in technical terms, but driven by the same objective: reduce unpredictability, minimize resistance, control reproduction, ambition, identity, not through force, but through normalization. If this feels abstract, good. That means the conditioning is working. Real control never announces itself. It blends into daily life so completely that questioning it feels extreme. That's why stories like this were buried. Not because they are unbelievable, but because they are too believable. They reveal how little brutality is actually required to shape human behavior at scale. And now you're carrying that awareness forward. Whether you use it or suppress it is the next test. There's a moment in every descent where the mind looks for escape routes. It starts whispering, "This is just history. This is extreme. This couldn't happen now." That whisper isn't logic, it's self-defense. Because if this story stays in the past, you don't have to change how you see the present. But forbidden history doesn't exist to shock you. It exists to train perception. The Alabama village teaches a brutal lesson. Control doesn't need total power. It only needs enough authority at the right pressure points. Reproduction, health, morality, information. When those are centralized, everything else follows. Ask yourself why the system focused on pregnancy rather than labor or land. Because reproduction is leverage over the future. A man who cannot imagine descendants becomes easier to manage. His timeline shrinks. His tolerance for injustice increases. He starts living day to day instead of legacy to legacy. That's not weakness. That's design. The men of the village were not cowards. They were trained to see protection as futile. Over time, they learned that intervention only brought social punishment. And once the cost of resistance outweighs the hope of success, resistance collapses internally. No change required. This is why institutions love complexity. When systems are too complicated to challenge, people default to compliance. In the village, medicine was too advanced. Theology was too sacred. Authority was too established. The average man was taught that his intuition was inferior to expert judgment. Sound familiar? Here's the psychological trap. When authority claims to act for your good, questioning it feels immoral. That's how men are disarmed, not physically, but ethically. You stop trusting your own perception because you've been told someone smarter, holier, or more qualified is handling it. The woman who asked questions violated that rule. Not because she was loud, but because she trusted her pattern recognition over institutional reassurance. That is the most dangerous act in any controlled environment. And she paid for it by being erased. Understand this clearly. Erasure is more effective than execution. Execution creates martyrs. Erasure creates doubt. It makes future questioners wonder if they imagined the problem in the first place. That's why there are no heroes in this story. No saviors. No dramatic uprising. Just a slow, methodical extraction of agency until the population forgot what agency felt like. The descent deepens here, because once you recognize this mechanism, you start noticing how often modern life asks you to trade intuition for instruction. And every time you do, the system tightens its grip, without ever touching you at all. By now, you're beginning to see the pattern. It isn't just about one village, one date, one century. It's about how systems survive by teaching compliance as inevitability. When a population believes outcomes are fixed, they police themselves. They enforce rules without anyone telling them to. They mourn on schedule. They accept authority without question. And that is the most efficient form of control imaginable. Notice how subtle it is. Nothing is overt. No guns, no chains, no open threats. Just ritualized loss, framed as divine order, backed by experts, normalized across generations. People repeat the behavior because it feels like survival, because stepping outside the pattern feels dangerous, because the fear of unknown consequences outweighs the desire for freedom. Here's the critical lesson most men never see. This is not limited to obscure villages or forgotten history. It is a blueprint. And once you recognize the blueprint, you realize how pervasive it is. From modern bureaucracies to educational systems, from corporate hierarchies to social norms, patterns of obedience are taught quietly, enforced subtly, and celebrated publicly. The village perfected the cycle. Birth, hope, loss, silence, acceptance. Repeat. The mechanisms were small, almost invisible, but the impact was profound. They removed the possibility of resistance. And the removal of resistance is how control becomes permanent. Every man listening now has probably encountered something similar in scale, if not in intensity. A system that dictates your behavior without ever saying it outright. A rule you follow because questioning it seems pointless. An outcome you accept because deviation is unthinkable. These are echoes of the same architecture the Alabama village embodied over a century ago. This is why it matters that you pay attention. Awareness alone begins the unraveling. Recognition is the first step in reclaiming agency. Once you understand the invisible forces shaping outcomes, you can begin to anticipate them, manipulate them, and, eventually, detach from them. But understanding is only half the work. To truly wake up, you need to acknowledge how deeply these systems shape perception, desire, and expectation. You need to admit that fear, shame, and obedience have been cultivated in subtle, almost invisible ways, and that they are still cultivating you now. And here's the moment where I want you to engage. Type the phrase "I see the pattern" twice in the ritual, normalize outcomes, and ensure the population self-regulates. It is easy to dismiss this as conspiracy, but the Alabama village proves that the tools of control are rarely about dramatic intervention. They are about shaping perception, teaching expectation, engineering behavior over generations. One small village, repeated across continents, proves that the most effective oppression is quiet, administrative, and invisible. Now, pay attention, because here's where the story turns inward. Knowledge alone is not enough. You must recognize your own patterns of compliance. Which rules do you follow unquestioningly? Which fears have you internalized as inevitabilities? Which outcomes do you accept because deviation feels impossible? Answer honestly, and then anchor that awareness. Comment "I see the pattern" twice, again. Not for visibility, not for recognition. For yourself. To mark the point where you begin reclaiming agency, and where the descent becomes a deliberate journey rather than passive observation. Once that's done, you are ready to descend further, into the mechanics, the levers, and the human cost of controlling life itself. Now we enter the most disturbing layer, the orchestration of inevitability. The Alabama village's tragedy was not chaotic. It was scheduled, engineered, and ritualized. Every loss occurred on the same date for a reason. Not divine, not natural, but because the men and institutions orchestrating it understood timing better than any midwife or preacher. They understood the human psyche. Why timing matters. Humans learn through expectation. If suffering is predictable, it becomes normalized. If trauma repeats identically, it teaches obedience without threat. The villagers were trained to anticipate loss, not prevent it. By embedding control into the natural rhythms of life, the architects removed rebellion before it could manifest. Every tool of manipulation you encounter in modern life borrows from the same principle. Predictability shapes behavior. Marketing uses it. Bureaucracy uses it. Education uses it. Social norms use it. When people anticipate outcomes, their minds and actions align. Voluntary obedience becomes instinct. Now, consider the human cost. In the Alabama village, women internalized failure. Men internalized helplessness. Children never born carried no memory, but the expectation of loss echoed into surviving generations. Trauma, once institutionalized, becomes a behavioral inheritance. Not genetic, not visible, but encoded in anticipation, expectation, and fear. This is how silent systems endure. They don't need armies. They need ritual, repetition, and a few visible punishments to remind everyone else of consequences. One woman questioned the timing. One man faltered in faith. One midwife diverged from protocol. And the system corrected itself quietly, efficiently. That is the genius of control. It is resilient, scalable, and invisible. And it is still in operation today. Not in villages or small towns, but in the rhythms of modern life. Schedules, obligations, laws, incentives, and the invisible pressures of society. The architecture remains, refined over centuries. The same levers, hidden in plain sight, pull behavior without consent. This is where forbidden knowledge becomes dangerous. Because seeing these levers awakens you to your own patterns of submission. It forces recognition. How many routines, rules, and inevitable outcomes have you internalized without question? How many have shaped your ambitions, your body, your family, your mind? Awareness here is not passive. It is the first step toward autonomy. It is the point where curiosity transforms into action, observation becomes strategy, and fear becomes leverage for personal freedom. From here, the descent deepens further, into the shadows of intentional human manipulation, where morality, science, and ritual converge to orchestrate life itself. We have now arrived at the core of the mechanism, intentional manipulation of life itself. The village in Alabama was not an accident. It was a deliberate orchestration of biology, belief, and authority. What makes this terrifying is not just the loss of children, but the lesson embedded in each cycle. Life was predictable, controllable, and obedient. Every birth, or absence of one, reinforced submission. Every mother learned that hope had a schedule. Every man learned that resistance was futile. Every family internalized compliance. Notice the elegance. The system did not rely on punishment alone. It relied on expectation. People became their own enforcers. The rituals, the sermons, the remedies, they were the framework. The villages carried the weight of control themselves, without the architects ever touching them again. And this is the principle still alive today. Authority rarely needs to act directly. It only needs to shape the environment, embed expectations, and let people regulate themselves. Schools, governments, corporations, religious institutions, they all leverage the same mechanism. Compliance becomes automatic. Fear becomes internalized. Agency becomes optional. Now, consider what this means for men alive today. How many choices have been preempted by invisible expectations? How many desires never acted on because subtle social rules created a sense of inevitability? How many behaviors have been silently guided toward outcomes that serve someone else's agenda? The Alabama village shows the full life cycle: hope, intervention, compliance, internalization, and erasure. Each stage reinforcing the next. By controlling reproduction, they controlled the future. By controlling behavior, they controlled the present. And by normalizing suffering, they controlled perception itself. The lesson is simple, but brutal. The most effective control systems are invisible because they make the subjects participate willingly. Obedience feels safe. Silence feels righteous. Resistance feels absurd. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Recognition becomes dangerous, not because the system is stronger, but because you see its threads weaving through everything you thought was natural. At this point, pause. Reflect. Consider the structures you inhabit. Begin to trace the hidden levers in your own life. And if you are ready to take the next step in understanding, commit to it consciously. Type again, "I see the pattern," twice. Not for anyone else, but for yourself. Lock in the awareness. Anchor it. Because from here, the story shifts from observation to revelation, from history to the psychology of power and manipulation that extends far beyond any single village. Now, we confront the unspoken truth. Control thrives on invisibility. The Alabama village teaches a brutal lesson. Power rarely needs to announce itself. It operates quietly, through expectation, ritual, and repetition. No grand conspiracies. No dramatic displays. Just the slow accumulation of obedience, reinforced by fear, tradition, and perceived inevitability. The villagers weren't coerced. They were trained. Every mother, every father, every child internalized the rules. By the time an outsider might have intervened, the system had already succeeded. Hope was scheduled. Resistance was optional, but the cost was unbearable. And compliance became instinctive. Look closely. The most effective mechanisms are the ones you participate in willingly. If the subject polices himself, enforces rules on others, and shapes his own behavior to fit the system's objectives, no visible enforcer is needed. That is why the village's tragedy endured across generations, because the victims became the guardians of their own captivity. This is how subtlety becomes power, how silence becomes enforcement, how expectation becomes the backbone of control. And the lesson is universal, not limited to villages or centuries. Corporations, governments, religious hierarchies, and social institutions all rely on the same principle. Reduce variables. Normalize outcomes. Ensure compliance without overt confrontation. Now, confront your own life. How often have you accepted outcomes because they just happened that way? How often have you deferred decision-making because someone else claimed expertise? How often have invisible rules guided your behavior without your awareness? Recognizing these patterns is the first act of liberation, but it also comes with responsibility. Awareness forces action. Knowledge demands choice. Once you see the levers, you cannot ignore them. And that is precisely why forbidden history is dangerous. Not because it shocks, but because it awakens. The village is gone. The buildings decayed. The names erased. But the blueprint remains, carried forward in institutions, norms, and expectations. The lessons of that place are alive, embedded in systems you interact with daily, shaping your behavior, steering your choices, and influencing your mind. And now, the descent deepens further. We leave behind the physical village and step into the architecture of control itself, the hidden levers that shape not just life, but thought, desire, and identity. This is where the story becomes personal, and where understanding the past equips you to see the unseen forces shaping your present. The most insidious systems are the ones that never announce themselves. The Alabama village demonstrates this with terrifying clarity. Power didn't need soldiers. It didn't need decrees. It only needed structure, ritualized loss, centralized authority, expectation enforced through culture and belief. And once the system was internalized, the villages enforced it themselves. The cycle repeated flawlessly, year after year, without overt coercion. This is the principle that defines all enduring control. Make the subject complicit in their own subjugation. Teach the rules, embed the rituals, normalize the outcomes, and let them internalize compliance as morality. Once this happens, external enforcement becomes unnecessary. Fear, shame, and expectation do the work. And the cycle becomes self-perpetuating, generation after generation. Modern society operates on the same principle, though it is dressed in sophistication. Metrics, deadlines, social norms, institutional policies, media narratives, all subtly teach what is acceptable, what is inevitable, what must be deferred. And like the village, people internalize the rules. They enforce them on themselves and others. Compliance becomes instinct. Obedience feels natural. Questioning feels unnatural. Now reflect on your own life. How many outcomes do you accept because they have been framed as inevitable? How many choices have been shaped by unspoken rules? How often do you defer to authority because tradition, expectation, or fear suggests it is safer than rebellion? This is the quiet horror that historians rarely acknowledge. The most enduring oppression is invisible. It doesn't demand attention. It works because no one notices it. And once it becomes internalized, resistance is not only discouraged, it feels morally wrong. The Alabama village also teaches a darker lesson. Those who notice patterns, who question timing, who trust their intuition over authority, are dangerous to the system. One woman noticed the synchronization of pregnancies. One man may have doubted sermons, and their very awareness made them targets. Not because they did anything overtly rebellious, but because they threatened the invisible architecture of control. From here, we enter the final act of the descent. We move beyond historical example and into the mechanics of modern manipulation, the hidden levers shaping thought, behavior, and identity. Once you see them, there is no retain. Recognition is the point of no innocence, but it is also the point of power. And now, you are standing at that threshold. Now we must confront the uncomfortable truth. Systems of control are designed to outlast memory. The Alabama village is proof. The villagers lost children on the same date, year after year, and eventually forgot that resistance was ever possible. Trauma, ritual, and expectation rewrote history in the minds of the living. Those who might have remembered, or questioned, were silenced, by fear, by social pressure, or by disappearance. And once memory fades, compliance becomes automatic. This is how power survives. Not by force, but by shaping perception, by controlling what people expect from life, by embedding obedience in routine, making deviation seem irrational. Once the rules are internalized, the population polices itself. And that, more than any weapon or decree, is the ultimate leverage. Consider the invisible patterns you encounter daily. Work schedules, social hierarchies, legal frameworks, behavioral norms. Each one is a lesson in expectation. Follow it, and the system rewards you. Comfort, stability, inclusion. Question it, and the system punishes. Social rejection, bureaucratic friction, subtle isolation. And the pressure is constant, Because the mechanisms are invisible. This is why the architects of control often operate openly. They don't hide because secrecy is unnecessary. They hide in plain sight, behind legitimacy, tradition, morality, expertise. Their tools are not intimidation or violence. They are structure, ritual, and expectation. And those who notice and question are anomalies, threats to the pattern, and must either be absorbed, corrected, or erased. The woman in Alabama who dared to ask why the pregnancies synchronized was such an anomaly. She disrupted expectation. She exposed pattern recognition. And she vanished, not because she resisted overtly, but because the system could not allow awareness to persist. One consciousness seeing through the architecture was dangerous enough. Now, pay attention to yourself. Where are you complicit in systems you barely understand? Where do you obey without questioning because that's how it's done? Where do you defer authority because deviation feels socially or morally unsafe? Recognizing these points is not comfort, it is responsibility. Awareness here is dangerous, but necessary. And as we descend deeper, you will begin to see not only the mechanics of historical control but the hidden threads woven through modern life. Threads that guide thought, shape behavior, and constrain freedom. From this moment, observation becomes power. But only if you are willing to trace the patterns to their source. The most chilling revelation is this. Control is rarely about individual acts, it is about shaping generations. In the Alabama village, the synchronization of pregnancies wasn't a single crime. It was a curriculum, a generational lesson in obedience, inevitability, and expectation. Every child born, or not born, learned the rules before they could even speak. Every adult reinforced them, not because they were cruel, but because they had internalized them. Compliance became a habit, suffering became a ritual, and the system perpetuated itself, invisible and enduring. This is the blueprint of modern manipulation, subtle, patient, and generational. It doesn't rely on dramatic interventions. It relies on the quiet orchestration of expectation. Social norms, education, law, corporate policy, media, all teach obedience through reinforcement, repetition, and normalization. And most people participate willingly, believing it is natural, moral, or necessary. Now consider your own life. How many of your choices are yours? How much of what you accept is inherited expectation? How often do you act against instinct because someone, somewhere, taught you compliance is safer than autonomy? These patterns are the invisible architecture of modern control. They operate beneath consciousness, shaping thought before it can articulate dissent. The Alabama village is terrifying because it exposes this architecture in its purest form. Timing, ritual, authority, expectation, fear, and memory intertwine to create obedience without overt coercion. And yet, it is not unique. Variations of this system exist wherever authority can enforce expectation without transparency. Here is the point of transformation. Awareness is your first act of rebellion. Recognizing these patterns is dangerous, not because they harm you, but because they reveal the system is not natural, it is constructed. And every constructed system has vulnerabilities, especially when recognition spreads. If you haven't done so yet, comment "I see the pattern" twice. Not to prove anything to others, but to anchor this awakening. To mark your emergence from passive observation to deliberate recognition. To begin owning the power of insight the system fears most. Once you commit to awareness, the descent continues, not into fear, but into clarity. And from clarity comes choice. And from choice comes the potential to reclaim autonomy in a world designed to quietly remove it. The Alabama village proves a principle most men never truly grasp. Fear is more effective when invisible. No chains, no mobs, no public execution. Just the quiet, constant presence of expectation. Every woman knew what would happen. Every man knew he could do nothing. Every family internalized a schedule of grief. And over decades, this invisible pressure became indistinguishable from natural law. People obeyed because they believed the outcome was inevitable, not because they were forced. This is the lesson hidden in plain sight. Systems survive not through brutality alone, but by shaping perception. When expectation becomes destiny, and compliance becomes instinct, resistance is not only difficult, it feels immoral. It feels unnatural. It feels impossible. Consider the implications for modern life. Social structures, institutions, corporate hierarchies, media narratives, They all rely on the same principle. The mechanisms have changed, data analytics, surveillance, algorithms, but the outcome is identical. The subject self-polices, internalizes limits, and rarely notices the manipulation. The Alabama village is terrifying because it strips away the illusion that suffering and control are random. Every loss was intentional, every ritual purposeful. And the lesson embedded in this pattern extends beyond the historical moment. Humans can be conditioned to accept even the unimaginable if it is normalized over time. And here's the point most men overlook: recognizing these patterns is not comfort, it is responsibility. Once you see the levers, you can no longer claim ignorance. Awareness carries its own weight. Observation is no longer passive, it becomes active. You are now a participant, a witness, and a potential disruptor. From this point, the story turns inward. You must begin to identify the levers in your own life, the invisible forces shaping behavior, desire, and thought. Trace the patterns of expectation. Notice where obedience feels natural. Ask yourself what outcomes you accept because the system has taught you to do so. This is the moment of initiation. Once seen, these patterns cannot be unseen. And that awareness, while dangerous, is the precursor to autonomy, strategy, and true power. The descent continues. And now, the journey moves from historical evidence into the psychology of submission itself, where faith, ritual, and expectation converge to shape generations without ever lifting a hand. Now, let's confront the uncomfortable anatomy of obedience. In the Alabama village, obedience was not demanded. It was cultivated. Ritual, repetition, and expectation created a feedback loop. Women learned to anticipate loss. Men learned that intervention was futile. Children learned to observe without acting. Every individual became both subject and enforcer. And because each participant internalized the system, compliance was permanent, self-sustaining, and invisible. This is the architecture of all enduring control, self-policing obedience. External threats are unnecessary when the mind enforces limits autonomously. Fear does not need to be loud. It only needs to be consistent. And repetition, ritualized over time, converts trauma into habit, and expectation into instinct. Consider your own environment. The mechanisms may appear modern: deadlines, rules, social expectations, media narratives. But the principle is identical: shape behavior subtly, teach anticipation, reward compliance, punish deviation, and allow individuals to internalize the system. Once internalized, no one needs to monitor you. The system monitors itself. Here's where the Alabama village becomes a masterclass in applied behavioral control. The women were not simply victims, they were conditioned to participate in their own subjugation. Men were not passive observers, they were trained to accept futility and enforce norms. And children, those who survived, were molded into the next generation of compliant participants. That is the genius and terror of systemic control. It is invisible, resilient, and self-replicating. The architects do not need to be present constantly. Their methods endure across decades and generations. The village's cycle was not chaos. It was precision engineering of expectation and behavior. Now reflect. Where have you internalized expectation without question? Where have you ceded autonomy because authority seemed inevitable? Where have you allowed routine to replace choice? Recognition here is dangerous, because the moment you see the system, you see your own complicity. And that awareness is power. But only if you commit to observing without denial. Only if you allow yourself to trace the patterns, question the rituals, and identify the invisible levers shaping your mind. From here, the descent moves deeper, into the hidden strategies that shape thought, desire, and identity before a single order is ever given. Here is the chilling truth few will admit. Control is most effective when it masquerades as protection. In the Alabama village, rituals, remedies, and sermons were presented as mercy. Women were told they were fragile. Men were told resistance was futile. Children were told obedience was righteous. Everyone believed the system existed for their benefit, yet every layer of guidance reinforced the same brutal outcome: synchronized loss, internalized fear, and unquestioning compliance. This is the key principle of enduring manipulation, disguised coercion as care. When suffering is framed as inevitable, and obedience as moral, compliance feels voluntary. People do not resist because they are convinced the system serves them. The illusion of benevolence masks the architecture of control. Look around today. Institutions still operate on the same logic. Rules are justified as safety. Metrics are framed as progress. Advice is framed as protection. And the mechanisms behind the scenes, expectation, repetition, subtle punishment, reward structures, shape behavior without visibility. People police themselves. Obedience becomes instinctive. Questioning seems selfish, reckless, or immoral. The Alabama village teaches a final lesson: hey, once perception is shaped, behavior follows without force. Men learn futility. Women learned inevitability. Children learn to obey. And those who noticed the anomalies were neutralized. That is why the system survived unchallenged for decades. This is the moment where the story becomes personal. Recognition of invisible control is not academic. It is transformative. Once you see the levers, you cannot unsee them. You cannot ignore your own participation. And you must begin to trace patterns in your life. The rituals you obey, the fears you internalize, the outcomes you accept as inevitable. Come and I see the pattern twice now. Lock in the awareness. Anchor it in your mind. This is not performative. It is a ritual of recognition, an acknowledgement that the descent is no longer abstract. It is within you. From this point forward, every observation, every choice, and every pattern you notice becomes a tool, a means to reclaim autonomy. Because the systems that shape behavior can also be anticipated, disrupted, and mastered once you understand them. And the descent continues deeper. Now we move from recognition of control to the mechanisms of psychological domination, where thought, identity, and expectation are manipulated before action ever occurs. Now we step into the machinery behind the visible patterns, psychological domination. The Alabama village demonstrates the blueprint in its purest form. Control wasn't enforced with violence. It was encoded in belief, ritual, and expectation. The women internalized loss. The men internalized helplessness. Children internalized obedience. And each generation reinforced the cycle, teaching compliance as natural, inevitable, and righteous. This is how the most powerful systems operate. They engineer thought before action. You begin to act a certain way not because you were ordered to, but because your mind has been trained to anticipate consequences, fear deviation, and internalize expectation. The body obeys the mind, and the mind obeys the system, creating a self-reinforcing loop of submission. In modern terms, we call this conditioning. It appears in workplace culture, education, social expectation, and governance. The tools may be subtler, metrics, incentives, social pressure, but the outcome is identical. Humans enforce limits on themselves before anyone else intervenes. The Alabama village shows the ultimate form of this, synchronization. The loss of children wasn't chaotic. It was scheduled. Bodies, minds, and social structures aligned to reproduce a predictable outcome. One woman questioned the schedule, and the system responded by erasing her presence. Not punishment, it was pattern protection. Anomalies could not exist. Now, apply this to yourself. What are the invisible rules governing your decisions? Which fears are truly yours, and which were implanted by expectation? Which outcomes do you accept as inevitable, and why? Recognition of these mechanisms is your first step to autonomy. The architects of influence rely on invisibility. Their power multiplies when subjects obey without noticing. But the moment awareness arises, the invisible becomes vulnerable. Recognition is dangerous to the system and liberating to the observer. From here, the descent deepens. We move past historical events and into the modern echoes of systemic manipulation, the strategies that shape populations today, and the subtle architecture of influence designed to guide thought, behavior, and identity before a single command is ever given. This is where awareness becomes a weapon, and insight becomes your first act of rebellion. Here is where forbidden history converges with modern life. Systems don't need violence, they need expectation. The Alabama village proves this. No soldier enforced compliance. No law dictated behavior. The synchronization of pregnancies, the rituals of mourning, the quiet acceptance of inevitability, these were enough. People internalized the rules. Fear became instinct. Obedience became habit. The system replicated itself without overt action. This is the principle hidden in plain sight. Expectation is leverage. When you teach someone what is inevitable, resistance collapses. When you normalize suffering, compliance feels natural. When you frame obedience as morality, questioning feels immoral. The most effective systems exploit this quietly, invisibly, and permanently. Modern life is rife with the same mechanisms. Workplaces, governments, social hierarchies, cultural norms, they teach behavior subtly, often under the guise of protection, efficiency, or progress. People self-regulate. They punish themselves before anyone else needs to. And the system grows stronger with each internalized rule. Now, turn the lens inward. Which patterns in your life are reinforced by expectation rather than choice? Which fears, rituals, or outcomes have been normalized to the point that obedience feels instinctive? Recognition is the first and most dangerous step. Once you see the levers, you cannot unsee them. You cannot ignore your participation. And that awareness is the foundation of power. The Alabama village also demonstrates a harsher truth. Those who notice patterns, who question inevitability, become threats. One woman observed synchronization. One man may have questioned faith or ritual. The system neutralized anomalies not through spectacle, but through disappearance, social pressure, or erasure from memory. Control survives by protecting the pattern. This is the moment of transformation. You are no longer just a passive observer of history. You are beginning to trace the architecture of control in your own life. You are beginning to recognize the invisible levers guiding thought, behavior, and identity. To solidify this recognition, comment "I see the pattern" twice. Do it not for validation, but as a ritual of commitment. Anchor your awareness. Claim the moment where observation transforms into insight, and insight into strategy. From here, the descent moves into the final layers, the orchestration of influence, the subtle manipulation of populations, and the mastery of unseen power that shapes the world around you. Now we arrive at the ultimate lesson. Control is not about force. It is about shaping perception. The Alabama village shows this with brutal clarity. No one needed to threaten the villagers with overt violence. Expectation, ritual, and timing did the work. Women internalized loss before it occurred. Men internalized helplessness. Children internalized obedience. And each generation reinforced the pattern, making resistance unnecessary. Compliance became instinctive. Fear became invisible. And the cycle perpetuated itself, silently and efficiently. This is the blueprint of all enduring control. Systems survive not by coercion alone, but by engineering the mind. Teach expectation. Normalize outcomes. Reward conformity. Punish deviation subtly. Let the population self-police. Once obedience is internalized, the system strengthens itself without interference. Modern parallels are everywhere. Corporations, governments, educational institutions, social hierarchies, they all rely on shaping perception. Algorithms, policies, cultural norms, they teach what is normal, acceptable, and safe. People comply willingly, policing themselves and each other. Resistance feels irrational. Deviation feels immoral. And yet, it is all engineered. The Alabama village also demonstrates another principle. Anomalies must be neutralized. The woman who questioned the synchronization of pregnancies disrupted expectation. One man may have hesitated in faith or ritual. Their awareness threatened the system. And so, they were erased. Not publicly, not dramatically, but permanently. Control survives by protecting the pattern. Now, turn the lens inward. How many of your decisions are dictated by invisible expectation? Which fears are implanted rather than innate? Which outcomes have been normalized, subtly guiding your behavior without your conscious consent? Recognition of these mechanisms is the first step toward autonomy. The descent intensifies because awareness carries responsibility. You can no longer pretend the world is neutral. You see the levers. You see the architecture. You see the patterns that shape thought, behavior, and identity long before a command is ever issued. This is the point where knowledge becomes dangerous and powerful. Once you see, you cannot unsee. You cannot ignore. You are now capable of navigating the system, disrupting its patterns, and reclaiming agency that others accept as impossible. From this point, the journey continues into the deepest shadows, the strategies of unseen influence, the architecture of behavioral control, and the mechanisms by which power silently dominates populations. There is a final illusion that keeps systems alive longer than they deserve, the belief that awareness alone is enough. It isn't. The Alabama village proves this in a way most men miss. Even when some sensed something was wrong, even when patterns were felt in the bones, nothing changed, because awareness without orientation becomes paralysis. People knew. They felt it. But they didn't know what to do with knowing. That is how systems survive awakening. Power doesn't fear knowledge. It fears directed knowledge. Knowledge that turns inward. Knowledge that sharpens instinct. Knowledge that changes behavior instead of just feeding curiosity. The villagers lacked that orientation. They had no framework for action, no language for resistance, no model of autonomy. Their awareness floated, unanchored, until fear pulled it back into silence. And silence preserved the system. This is where modern men often fail. They consume forbidden information, hidden history, exposés, patterns, and then nothing. No internal shift, no behavioral change. Awareness becomes entertainment, a dark aesthetic, a temporary thrill. The system welcomes that, because information that doesn't alter action is harmless. The lesson here is brutal. Seeing the pattern is not enough. You must recognize how the pattern trains you, how it shapes your risk tolerance, your ambition, your sense of inevitability, your willingness to defy. The Alabama village trained men to think small, to live short timelines, to detach from legacy. That was not accidental. A man who does not think in generations is easy to manage. A man who expects lost plans less, builds less, challenges less. Ask yourself, honestly, how far into the future you allow yourself to think. That answer tells you how deeply the pattern has already worked on you. The descent now demands something different. Not belief, not outrage, but precision. Because once you understand how systems train the mind, you can begin reversing the process, first internally, then externally. And that is where real danger begins. Not for you,